Hi, my name is Kuko Mampo, and I have been belatedly appointed as the MC. So blame the people who appointed me for any mistakes I make. Welcome to the book launch for Architecture and Politics in Africa, Making, Living, and Imagining Identities Through Building. We're hosted here today by the Institute of African Studies, represented by the director, Dr. Samuel Intewusu. Dr. Samuel Intewusu holds a PhD in history from Leiden University in the Netherlands and an MPhil in African Studies here from the University of Ghana. Some of his publications include Settling in and Holding On, a socio-historical study of northern traders and transporters in Accra's to-do, and Chieftaincy, Culture and Development in Africa, an undergraduate course book. Welcome, Dr. Samuel Intewusu.
Thank you.
Who will now give us a welcome address.
Thank you very much for the brief introduction. On behalf of my colleagues at the Institute of African Studies, I would like to welcome everyone to the Institute where the workshop titled Architecture in Africa's International Relations and a book launch is held. I am certain that the birth of the workshop and the book was with hard work and commitment from determined faculty and practitioners from different institutions with very strong networks. I give recognition to your effort in conceptualizing such an important workshop and a book which are considered critical to the African continent. The goals of the workshop, which include bringing together scholars and urban planners working on architecture and politics in Africa together to share work and develop a collection of papers for publication in a special journal issue aimed at raising the profile of the politics of architecture across the continent is not only appropriate but very urgent, especially at this time. At this time that we have issues of space identity making, which seem to be dividing families and then communities as well as the state. But we may ask, to what extent does the goals and aims of the workshop and this book launch align with the activities of the Institute of African Studies? I am informed that the goals and aims are driven by a perspective which is dependent on a network of scholars and practitioners working on architectural issues in Africa. This holistic approach aligns with the founding vision of the Institute of African Studies and its operations today. The Institute, which is multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary, carries out its mission by engaging in the regeneration of Africa and her people through knowledge production, dissemination, application, and preservation. In very concrete terms, your workshop on architecture in Africa's international relations and the book on architecture and politics in Africa upholds the vision of the Institute of African Studies through the privileging of knowledge on African people, their cultural history, and their identity using architectural scholarship as a lens. Leafing through the book, the different chapters address the broad perspectives that are relevant to African studies, examples of which include architectural history, building technology, urbanism, conservation, among others. I do not have to speak more than the editors and the authors. I, however, will conclude by congratulating the editors and the authors for such detailed research work. Once again, welcome to the Institute of African Studies, and thank you for honoring us with your book launch. Thank you.
Before I invite Prof. Judah Gallagher, I have to correct myself. It's Prof. Samuel Intewusu, not Doctor.
Doctor is fine, please.
No, because corrected. So next we have Prof. No mistakes this time. Judah Gallagher from SOAS University of London, who is my supervisor and soon to be Emmanuel's supervisor, but mine first for the record. So she's a professor of African politics at SOAS University of London, and her research builds on a long-standing interest and engagement in statehood and international politics in and about Africa. Some of her publications include Zimbabwe's International Relations, Images of Africa, and Britain and Africa under Blair. She currently leads a 5-year research project on architecture and politics in Africa, of which this workshop, this book, and this book launch come under that.
Thank you very much, Kukra. Welcome, everybody. It's really nice to see you. I'd like to start by thanking the Institute, and in particular, Professor Ntewusu, for generously hosting the workshop and this book launch. But also to everybody at the Institute of African Studies who helped to organise this event. It's been, 18 months in the making? I mean, COVID didn't help, but yeah. And in particular to Dr. Irene Apienu-Adu, who has been, the two of us have been working on this together steadily since we met 4 years ago. It's been great fun, actually. It's been terrific fun, and it's been a delight to work with you, and I hope this continues. But I also particularly want to thank several other people who we couldn't have done this without. One of them is Sunil Pun, who's at the back there, who's operating the camera, who tirelessly and uncomplainingly organised flights, transfers, hotel bookings, and reorganised them and did them again and different ways. And I cannot thank this man enough. I really want to thank my colleague Innocent Batsani Tube, who was another member of our team who was instrumental in organising both parts of the workshop, who was meant to be here but couldn't make it at the last minute. We really miss him, and we thank him for all his work, because actually, we couldn't have done it without him. But then I really, really do want to thank Kukwa Manful and Emmanuel Forisapong, who both stood in and stepped up. I mean, they were involved from the beginning, but at the very last minute, when IB couldn't come, they both leapt into the vacuum. It was so, actually, just, I'm going to cry. It was so lovely, and I'm terribly delighted that this happened. But I have to talk about the book. So down to business. And the publisher of the book told me I was to bring a copy and wave it around. So here it is. But I didn't bring any copies to sell because it's actually free online, and I didn't think I'd lug copies over just to take them home again. So the book began its official life at a workshop which we organised with the University of Johannesburg in just at the end of 2019, before the first lockdown, which was held at the Johannesburg Institute of Advanced Studies. And at that point, the plan was to get together people who worked on politics with people who worked on architecture, and see what happened when we explored what architecture could mean politically in the broadest possible terms. In our team, our small team that was based at SOAS, we have Kukwa, who's actually the only architect among us. The rest of us come from backgrounds in anthropology, in political science, in development studies, and in political sociology. And it's been quite an adventure being so I wouldn't say at odds disciplinarily, because we have actually learned a lot from each other, but it's been a challenge but also a delight. And that's continued within both of these workshops. But this first workshop, we wanted to sort of see not just how architecture shaped political life from the perspective of architects and engineers who make it, or from the perspective of politicians who commission it, particularly thinking about the kind of architecture that we were mainly looking at this workshop, which were sort of state projects, state-funded projects, and I'll talk a little bit more. You'll gather a bit more about what these were in a minute. But also, many of us were particularly concerned and interested to know about how it was experienced and understood by citizens. So how do people who live with these buildings, how do they understand the politics of it? How do they feed into the politics of it? How are they shaped by the politics of it? All those questions. And after the workshop, what we did was we decided that we wanted to rethink what materiality meant in politics. Because in my discipline, in political science, political sociology, when we talk about materiality in politics, we often seem to be talking about the politics of the belly. So we're sort of talking about the way in which resources are used and abused sometimes. But we thought that actually we were onto something a bit more interesting, which was thinking about how politics is a material process. So it's about ideas, of course. It's about resources, of course. It's about the embodiment of the state as expressed by elites and as understood by populations. It's about the balance of the mutual creation of things and communities, and how these things impact on the political life of countries, of states, and of citizens. And I want to give you an example. If you could, Anthony, if you wouldn't mind just showing my picture. We're each going to talk about one picture. So I co-wrote a chapter in this book with Ariane Njore, which was looking at state buildings in Côte d'Ivoire. And in particular, we wanted to know how citizens in Abidjan understand their state in the ways that they read the buildings. And this is the very famous basilica in Yamoussoukro, which was built by Félix Houphouët-Boigny and opened in 1990. And this is the building that everybody wants to talk about in Côte d'Ivoire. It's the sort of the preeminent symbol of the state, even though it's a Catholic cathedral basilica. Now, this building is reputed to be the largest basilica in the world. And it's built in the middle of a modest town in the middle of Côte d'Ivoire. This building has attached to it all sorts of stories. It's said to have doubled the national debt. Okay, that's quite something. It's said to be taller than St. Peter's in Rome. And those of you who know St. Peter's in Rome will also see the architectural reference, really not very subtle, to the basilica in Rome. And very importantly, for many Ivoirians, it's said to have won the admiration of the world. So this building does lots of political work. At first sight, the building appears to overcome the possibility of popular criticism of the state. So when we talked to groups of citizens about this building, people always described it in very similar ways. They said, this is a jewel. This is magnificent. This is impeccable. This is really something wonderful. These are all quotes. One woman who told us that she was not Christian said, I saw the basilica, I entered it, it is perfect. This building seems to support the miracle narrative surrounding the presidency of Houphouët-Boigny and the destiny of Côte d'Ivoire under his direction. One man said, we wonder how all this could have been possible. And another said, Houphouët-Boigny was not an ordinary man. So there's a sort of real sense of the way in which God is co-opted in the support of the state through this building. I mean, there are many stories about how Houphouët-Boigny dreamed of building a massive cathedral in his hometown when he was just a child. So there's this sort of idea of destiny, but the intertwined destiny of the president and God. And it puts it beyond the ordinary and beyond reproach. You don't really argue with God. It's quite difficult anyway. So that's the first thing. The second thing is about the way in which this building is said to not just emulate but surpass European architecture. So there's obviously the Roman, and I'm talking about as in borrowed from Rome, the aesthetic. The materials, which were really mostly shipped from other parts of the world, it's not entirely clear to me. The only thing that I've found which is argued to have come or been sourced locally was the sand to mix the cement. So the windows were made in France, the chair leather came from Italy, the organ was shipped in from America, and so on. And there are constant references to the admiration that this building attracts from Europeans. So quotes from President Chirac, quotes from the Pope. The Pope was persuaded to come and inaugurate it, and so on. And it seems to say Côte d'Ivoire is at least as good as any European country. And you might argue, and I think I'm borrowing a little bit from my colleague Nandi Elle, who also writes about this building, that there's something about the way that this building sort of confirms Houphouët-Boigny's Frenchness, and perhaps his Frenchness in relation to his compatriots. And you might say, in Fanon's terms, this building suggests that the Ivoirian state speaks proper French, proper French. Okay, so third, but we're going to turn a bit different now. As if to undermine this emulation or this sort of glorification of France or Europe, the basilica also represents a trickster. So people love to tell stories about Houphouët-Boigny's jokes. So they talk about how he joked about the cost. So yes, doubled the national debt. But apparently when charged with this, he said, "What price can you put on a gift from God?" There's a story about how he fooled the Pope into coming to the inauguration. So apparently, this is the story, I have no idea if it's true. The Pope said, "I won't come if the building is bigger than St. Peter's." And Houphouët-Boigny said, yes, no problem, it won't be. And so the Pope came, did the dedication, and then after he'd gone, they put the orb and cross on the top, and it took it over the line. So it's taller than St. Peter's. People like that story. They also made a present of it to the Catholic Church. Well, it's very expensive to keep. So the Catholic Church, this was a very, very double-edged present. Now that's quite funny too. People thought that was clever. And then there's also a lot of debate about how Houphouët-Boigny had himself depicted in the stained glass windows in the biblical stories, which, that was a little bit big-headed perhaps of this man. Apparently he did it twice. And interestingly enough, this is the only black face among the images in the glass, which is also interesting. But this seems to suggest that, perhaps to the West, that Côte d'Ivoire doesn't respect your rules, actually. We do things in our own way. There's something quite subversive about this building and the stories attached to it. And then finally, the building conveys a fragility of the state. And that's perceived and came out in the discussions that we had as we got towards the end of the discussions, when people started talking about the poor condition that the building is in. So they spoke anxiously about cracks or weeds in the fabric. And they worried about the condition appearing to embody the vulnerability of this miracle state. And it, obviously, since Houphouët-Boigny's death, this narrative sort of comes along with the idea that he can't be replaced. So the state as perfect, as miracle, as the envy of the world, as trickster, not to be taken at face value or too seriously, and finally as fragile, crumbling in peril. People read all these things in the materiality of a building that describes the complexity of the state, its projection to the rest of the world, and most importantly, I think, or for me, the most interestingly, its relationship with its citizens. Now, I'm just going to stop in a minute, but I just want to say, as the co-editor of the book, and I am co-editor with my colleagues Joanne Tomkinson and Daniel Mulugeta, who couldn't be here today, there are 12 chapters in the book, and they cover, apart from Côte d'Ivoire, chapters about Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Malawi, Nigeria, South Africa, and Zimbabwe. They are about airports, public housing, shopping malls, parliaments, palaces for traditional chiefs, police stations, libraries, prisons, cathedrals, ministries, and the African Union building. So we didn't cover everything, but we did try our best to do a lot. And you're going to hear from some of the people who wrote some of these chapters. And I have to say that they are all Ghanaians. This is not a coincidence. We are in Accra. So the other chapters are not. But I'm really delighted that we could be joined by 4 of our authors. And so I'm going to hand over, I think, Irene, to you next. Oh, sorry.
As Julia mentioned, Dr. Pieninado is going next. Irina Pieninado is a senior research fellow at the Institute of African Studies of the University of Ghana and a practicing architect in Ghana. Her PhD is from the University of Ghana, and she has a postgraduate degree in architecture from the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, and a master's degree in housing and inner city revitalization from the Institute of Housing and Urban Development Studies in Rotterdam. Her research focuses on African architecture and urban housing in West Africa, and the title of her chapter is New Homes for a New State, foreign ideas in Ghana's public housing programs. Welcome, Irene.
So I'll just give you a teaser and then encourage you to download the book and read. It is a very good book, diverse, and it speaks to different issues. So today, the deficit in Ghana's housing provision is estimated to be over 2 million housing units after several years of intervention. The Ghana National Housing Policy has chronicled several challenges and policy issues that have hampered efficient delivery of housing in Ghana. So my chapter talks about Ghana's public housing attempts during the transitional and early independence years of the new state. So in 1957, Ghana gained independence under Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. In my chapter, I argue that the new state's sense of responsibility for housing the growing urban population made it dependent in new ways on foreign actors, recreating and reimagining its dependency and showcasing the tension of the independence state-building project. So, according to the first president, he anticipated that Ghana gaining independence would make us a sovereign state where we could control our own resources. The independence of the country also led to mass migration from the rural areas into the urban spaces, and the country or the government officials needed to provide housing for the teeming masses of people migrating into the urban spaces, and also African officials occupying government positions. And so all these processes called for new housing, and yet Ghana's resources, financial resources, wasn't that much to be able to meet this housing requirement. And so the government, that is Kwame Nkrumah, had to turn to foreign partners to help in the delivery of housing units. So I discussed the state of public housing and house building agenda during the transitional years that, as I have already mentioned, and I draw out the challenges, contradictions, and the new kinds of dependencies which gave rise to the formation of numerous foreign partnerships with the Germans, with the Dutch, with the Americans, with the Canadians, with the British, with the Eastern Europeans, so many partnerships. So not only did the financial challenges, which I have already mentioned, hampered adequate housing provision, but then there was also the need for high building standards, which they described as suitable and superior. That is what the Housing Minister, Kojo Bochu, mentioned or required from the people. And then the fact that we kept on borrowing foreign designs and foreign expert advice. And we also kept on importing foreign building materials and technology. So in the end, these continuous engagements introduced influential and ubiquitous architectures, which were rooted in a complex hybrid of foreign styles, and this defined a particular form of statehood in Ghana. So read the book and you get more ideas. Thank you.
Thanks, Irene. Next, we've got Emmanuel. So Emmanuel, no title yet. Oh, no, title. Architect Emmanuel Kusio-Forisafon is an architect and lecturer at the School of Architecture and Design in Central University here in Ghana. He has a master's in architecture from the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, and his current research explores how various ideologies and historical events give shape to large-scale urban developments, civic spaces, cultural buildings, and housing. And the title of his chapter in this volume is Building Heaven on Earth, Political Rhetoric and Ritual over Ghana's National Cathedral. Welcome.
Okay, so the proposed National Cathedral of Ghana is interesting for a couple of reasons, and I'll state three of them here. To begin with, it is an interdenominational Christian cathedral, which is meant to be built not by one group of Christians, but by, to a very large extent, all groups of Christians. Secondly, it was not initiated by a religious leader or a monarch of any kind, as we are used to in history, but it was initiated by a democratically elected president. Finally, it is meant for the state, and it's intended to be used for national purposes rather than purely religious or ritual purposes by a particular group of Christians. My chapter, therefore, traces the modes of public persuasion adopted by the political and religious elites and interrogates how these leaders instrumentalize the architecture. That is, how do they instrumentalize its aesthetic, its embedded symbolism in their rhetoric. Now, I was curious about this particularly because the question for me was, how have those at the helm of affairs managed to garner public support for a project which seems frivolous at the first instance? How had they managed to navigate the vociferous opposition of many who called them out for attempting to build another church in a country that many would say has more churches than schools or hospitals? Now, for those of us who pay close attention to Ghanaian politics, it was interesting because when the state said they were going to build another parliament, people protested until they stopped, and they said, drop that chamber. Now, you would think that for a parliament which is a democratic building for everybody and accessible to everyone, it would have received more public support. So I was kind of curious about how are they managing to gain the support of people for this. Now, what was interesting to me was that, I would have thought that the confluence of democratic politics and plural religion, right, monumental architecture, would have led to the collapse of the project before it even began, because each of these are in themselves very controversial arenas of social and political action. Now, what happens if you sort of combine them? You would expect an ending controversy, and yet what I've discovered and argue is that rather than leading to the collapse of the project before it starts, the confluence of politics, religion, and monumental architecture has rather yielded elaborate forms of verbal and what I call, or what is often called, visual rhetoric. What are some of these? So for one, the president, Nana Akufo-Addo, has often been portrayed in the process not as a democratically elected president who has won power by the accident of history or by the efficacy of his campaign machinery. Rather, he's touted to be a wise king, like those of ancient biblical Israel, chosen and ordained by God to save the nation, a process which requires the making of this building. In another instance, the cathedral is framed by its architect, said David Adjaye, Ghanaian British, award-winning Ghanaian British architect, as a uniquely African building or uniquely African cathedral that once implemented will be able to unite all Christians, but does not end there, will also be able to unite Ghanaians of all religious persuasions. And for certain religious leaders, the making of this building will bring about blessings for the whole nation. And so you see the extent to which, the leaders and supporters of the project seem to go to try to convince us that this building or this project is absolutely necessary. Now, finally, I discovered that something quite surprising, that despite the stated intent to create a building that signifies the departure of Ghanaian Christianity from, let's say, European or Eurocentric architecture, or to make a building that is inherently and essentially African, you realize that the leaders rely heavily for the justification of the building and for the realization and for sources of inspiration on Jewish and American evangelical partnerships. And so, for example, in the process of trying to, raise funds for the project, a lot of American Republican senators were involved. They have tried, for example, so there was one time where one of these senators arranged for the president and his team, the board of trustees, which is a group of religious leaders he had put together to help him make the project a reality, visited the American Museum of the Bible as well as the Washington Cathedral, all in a bid to be inspired on the one hand, but also to potentially raise funds from American evangelicals for this project. Now, for those who are, students of politics, we should know that American evangelicalism comes with a certain, let me call it, in America, Christian nationalists, which has implications for the conflict in Israel. So they tend to be very pro-Israel in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and tend to align with the position of Israel. Relatedly, on 5th March 2020, and a lot of the ceremonies have been, done on the days of independence as a way to show that this is a really national project, a stone was imported from Israel and delivered by its ambassador to be buried in the position where the altar for the cathedral is supposed to be located. And so, as I argue, the conflation of politics, of religion, and of monumental architecture has really created a lot of elaborate, discourse and language, and also ceremonies, because a lot of the ceremonies tend to be very colorful with umbrellas and all of these things. And as I argue, all of these have been attempts to grant legitimacy to the project, but also to those who are involved in it. Now, I'll leave you with some questions on my mind, after having worked on this paper. Although the project, as some of us may know, is currently on standstill due to lack of funds, it didn't surprise me. The question is, how will future political leaders, particularly those of opposition parties, treat the project? How will the centering and privileging of relations with the American evangelical right and Israel influence the nation's foreign policy going forward? Thank you.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Next, we're going to have Tony Yeboah. Tony Yeboah is not the footballer. Tony Yeboah is a PhD candidate in history at Yale University. His dissertation examines the entangled themes of colonial power, the built environment, and community making in one of the greatest West African capitals, Kumasi. Tony is a contributor for the OER, Open Educational Resources Project, and his works have appeared in History in Africa Journal, the Journal of West African History, The Conversation, and Nursing Clio. And the title of his chapter, forgive me for butchering this, I don't know how to say this word, Asante Numena, The Politics and Imaginary Reconstruction of the Asante Palace in Kumasi. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you so much, Kukua, and thanks everyone for coming. You got it right. My chapter is entitled Asante Numena, The Politics and the Imaginary Reconstruction of the Asante Palace. So what I try to do with this chapter is to offer new approach for understanding architectural history. And here I really want to push experts of architecture to really consider the metaphysical conceptions of the built environment more seriously. So that is basically what I aim to do with this chapter. And here, I want to start by saying that, or continue by saying that, sometimes when I talk about this chapter, I get lost because I have a lot of historical details. I'm a historian, so please don't worry if you get lost along the way. So it all starts in 1874 when the British and the Asante had a war in Kumasi, which is the capital of the Asante Empire. Maybe in the chapter I use kingdom, so sometimes I use it interchangeably, so don't worry. So at the end of the war, the city was demolished, which meant that it affected the palace. The palace was razed in 1874. And so right after the war, we've had attempts by both the British colonial government, the Asante monarchy, members of the Asante society to rebuild the palace. So the first really important intervention or attempt to build this palace happened in 1925 when when Prempeh the First, so the first one, the king of Asante, a palace was built for him, and the whole point was to compensate Asante mine or Asante Empire for the palace they had destroyed in 1874. But the king was willing to live in the palace. But members of the Asante Mine Council, the council of the Asante Hene, the king of Asante, opposed it because the structure was very antithetical to Asante folk architecture. It limited spaces for the office of the Asante Hene. It was really European inspired design. It's built for a nuclear family, setting. So people opposed it, but the king wanted to live in it, so they allowed him to live in the house. But when he died in the 1930s, who took over from him, the Asante Hene Prempeh II, started the effort to rebuild the palace. So it meant that, so he was able to make all the necessary arrangements for the reconstruction of the new palace. But he died, and then a new king takes over, Opokuwari. And this is at the heart of my work. This king, 1970s, was able to raise some funds, but he couldn't raise enough to build what they have imagined. So he built something temporary for the office of the Asante Hene, the office of the Queen Mother, the Asante Hema, and for the keeping of the other regalia of the Asante society. And so we see that at least these two attempts that I have given, they all failed because they couldn't build the imagined palace. And I'm saying that, they weren't able to build it, but this material shortfall should give us another opportunity to think creatively about rebuilding or recreating the Asante Palace of 1874. And here's my argument. My argument is that the palace that was demolished in 1874 went into a different realm. Went with the soldiers, went with the Asante people who died. It went to a different realm, and philosophers call it Numina, the transcendental world. And in the Asante mind, they call it Asamando, the world of the ancestors. And so if we really want to think about rebuilding that palace, it's not possible. Let's forget it. There's no way they can build that palace because it will give room for modernity. So it means that it will fulfill the vernacular ideas about Asante architecture. Because then now you are creating new spaces because of modernity and change over time. And so then let's give people the opportunity to recreate the Asante Palace according to their own imaginations. And so we will be able to create, and this is based on the ideas. And the ideas, mainly the stories that they have heard about the Asante Kingdom. But here's the tricky question. Then if you give people the opportunity to recreate the Asante Palace, then it means we're going to have subjective palaces, right? We're going to have subjective construction. You create a different palace, you create a different palace, the other person creates a different palace. That is okay, because in the end, all our recreation takes us to one space, which is the Asamando, the Asante Nomina, right? So, and even though our designs, our creative designs may conflict, but the whole idea is that they are going to at least appeal to some of the major themes that we have heard about the Asante Palace. Oh, Asante Palace of the 19th century was wealthy, it was powerful. So those themes will influence what we create or recreate about the Asante Palace in the 19th century. Yeah. So I will end here, and yeah, thank you.
Now I am going to talk about my chapter. I'm not going to introduce myself because that would be a bit weird. So I wrote the afterword to this book, and Julia just mentioned just right before we started that the editors were like, with the first draft, were concerned about how critical it was.
Can I just correct you? It wasn't the editors, it was the publisher.
The publisher.
We loved it.
No, sorry. I meant the series editors, not you guys. Were concerned with how critical it was. And I didn't intend for it to be that critical. But I can see why, because it came out of my frustration, because at the time I was like also writing my PhD and engaging with a lot of archival sources and historical material about architecture in Africa. And one thing that just kept getting to me, and I've raised this with Prof. Elia recently, was just the tone, and I think with Christina we've discussed this, the tone of writing about historical architecture in Africa. You talk about people saying dwellings and hovels, right? And maybe you read it and think, okay, maybe this was a really poor area, but then you follow the writer, the travel writer who wrote such an account, and you see that they've written a book about the glories of Greek architecture and the glories of London in a time that there was no working sanitation system in London. So it's not that, there's something else happening there. And to me, this was a real diminution of African architectures. And I saw this as one of the tools of colonization. But these are my frustrations. And I thought that maybe while doing my PhD, and also the field of architecture history or architecture studies on Africa, were kind of indirectly and inadvertently reproducing some of these things. Like, what does it mean when we are mostly always studying the buildings done by licensed architects, the grand state buildings, the buildings that are formal in quotes? Especially, what does this mean in our countries where the informal is maybe 90% of architecture in the country? And what does it mean when you know that there are buildings? So like in Ghana, I can talk about Despite's house. I can talk about the Peace FM building. It looks like a ship. Very beautiful, expensively constructed buildings that are not formal. There's no architect involved. There's no licensed architect involved. They don't have a building permit because they can do what they want because they are rich. Like, what does it mean when we group such buildings with slums and shacks and then categorize them all as informal? So this is where that afterword started from, which I have to say went through a lot of. It started as something entirely different and finally came there. So maybe this is why it seemed very critical, because I felt that if we were studying architecture in Africa, then we should expand what we think of architecture, and we shouldn't follow these things that had been laid down by colonial powers on us with an intent of diminishing what we ourselves build and what we ourselves find beautiful and orderly. So this is what my afterword was doing. It was like, and I guess it was a bit ironic after this book that's like kind of looking at all this. This one is saying, why are we doing this? Let's stop looking at these buildings. But that's not what I was saying. I didn't think we should stop, but I think we should expand what we study. and not study, because usually when we study the informal, we are studying it in a very well-meaning way, but we are studying it as architecture of risk, architecture of poverty, of want, like something is missing there, something that we have to fix because we are trained like academics and architects and urban planners. But what if we look at them as architecture in their own right? What if we look for the beauty and understand the principles, the way that we will study classical Roman architecture and try and understand the principles and the orders behind the spacing of columns and the different decorations? What if we took the Spice House seriously instead of laughing at it and try to understand the principles and orders there? What if we took the little kiosk that mobile phone credit vendor made for themselves and took it seriously as a production of art, of architecture, of space, and analyzed it that way? So I look at different examples. I look at, I don't know if you know the Men's Gold building, also as a thing, like instead of just like sneering at it, like, oh, this is like, there's no class, there's no style, there's no taste. But no, like, let's find the style there. Maybe we can't read it because we've been trained in the canon and our eyes are only seeing a certain kind of style and taste architecturally. And then I also talk about even how people build normally. I do a range of interviews with people who have been building the same house for 15, 20 years, which is very normal, right? A lot of uncompleted buildings. Dominique is nodding because this is her thing. And it's not that they're uncompleted because people don't want to finish their buildings. You have to start somewhere. You raise the foundation. You wait a number of years, then maybe you have some money, then you raise it up to windowsill level. Then money comes, 2 years, nothing happens. The CD is now $10 to 1, so now we can't buy cement. Then maybe 3 years later it stabilizes and then we raise it there. What does it mean when we study these things as well? And people don't use architects for these kind of buildings. They build when they can, with what they can, where they are. What does it mean if we just like open the boundaries of what is called architecture? So this is what my afterword was about. Thank you. So I will walk as if I had finished, and then I have come back. The next stage is we invited two distinguished academics to provide some reflections on this book. I'm going to first introduce Prof. Nnamdi Ele, who will go first, and after which Dr. Lloyd Amoah. So Professor Nnamdi Ele is the head of the School of Architecture and Planning at Wits University. I'm saying Wits because I don't know how to say the full word. And he's the author of a lot of books for African architecture students here. I know you have seen African Architecture, Evolution and Transformation. This was like a transformational book in my life as an architecture student. Like this stuff that I'm saying about the framing of it, that was the first book I ever read about histories of architecture in Africa that did not talk about it like it was less than. It took it seriously, it engaged with this seriously, and then it provided this, probably talking too much, and I'm fangirling. But that's how highly I rate his book. So Prof. Nnamdi, before I go too much, welcome.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, Julia. May I go with the first name, Irene, and of course, Sonil, and my colleagues with whom I have spent the past few days, and Professor Samuel Ntewusu, and all our colleagues who've come from far and wide. Thank you so much, and thank you for the inspiration. I would like to just say one thing first. This is an original document. It's primary source, and it would remain a source for consultation on architecture and politics in Africa. The thing that struck me first was the organization. Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. And the organization into the 3 parts, which includes making, the first part. And this is the recognition that buildings don't just come and happen in the thin air like abracadabra. There is some sort of thinking, some negotiations behind the scene and then the assemblage process, and then the construction process. In fact, the architect is the one who is brought in last to come and organize the spaces. And the most important thing there is the discussions that has happened behind the scene, so that what you see standing as a building is the leftover. It's actually the shell of the discussions. What's been chopped out, what's been included, what's been kept is what's been handed over to the architect to discuss. But one thing came out of that in terms of Africa and international relations, or importation of material, as my colleague Julia has mentioned in terms of the Basilica. Everything comes from overseas, or there is some sort of negotiation that in the process of the negotiation, it appears that Africa's contributions is often marginalized. And so that's the first thing about the making. And I think that organization, there are numerous texts on architecture and politics, often written by architects, but they've never really come to read from this perspective. I'll highlight a few points along that at the end of my presentation. And fortunately, the chapters, including your erudite and energy field presentation summary, have been said. The second part is living. In other words, after this building is made, we are now living in it. We are now experiencing it. We are now enjoying it. But living is not just a process of inhabiting. If a building has been made for a particular purpose, and the purpose, for example, is the Worcester Police Station in Johannesburg, or any other space, like the Basilica itself, or shopping centers in Zimbabwe, whether they were made in the colonial times, post-colonial times, or in the contemporary times, the living process straddles three eras. The past, memory, it's hard to forget, especially if it is trauma. The present, it is raw, we live with it. The future, we project it into what might happen. And that's what buildings do. Because of that, architects have a responsibility on how they respond to making a building. So you have the making process, the assembly process, and then you have the experiential process, which is then everyday encounters, some by chance, some by experience, and in each case they straddle three timelines. And depending on how we handle it, those timelines can be traumatic, they could be celebrated, or they could be confusing. And that takes us to the third part of the book, imagining. And this is also connected to the idea of living and assembling. But it is from another perspective. The actors or the politicians, the architects, the power brokers who are in charge of assembling, negotiating, planning this building begin to project certain lived experiences. And I couldn't have said it better other than the way Julia said in Hofo-Boigny, being part of the stained glass. Please, I'm not proselytizing Christianity here. The particular scene was Palm Sunday, when Jesus is riding on the donkey to go to Jerusalem and people singing, Hosanna, Hosanna. And there you see all the St. Peter's, all the 12 disciples following, and everybody's walking along, which is Savior Apia. If you go to Jerusalem, you can see, you can imagine this venue, and you there, Hofobani was there shouting the highest. So there is something very, the way the future is being projected, which Emmanuel again has mentioned here in terms of how the National Basilica is being imagined, so that the body or the person, the personality of the people who are imagining this edifice and their own person become one. They almost become inseparable, both philosophically, ideologically, and almost become the total engines. Whether whoever they are soliciting to come and lift and help to make it happen, they are only the branches, but they also become part of the system. So with that, the work is a phenomenal contribution. And what sets it apart is that they've just interrogated what I call celebratory independence monuments. 1963-59, Udo Koltermann's New Directions in African Architecture, which discusses the main developments that is happening across the continent. One was earlier before the other, and it is almost celebratory. And recently, or in 2001, Okwi Enwezo et al., Independence and Liberation Movements, a huge catalog that moved from Munich to New York to Chicago, Los Angeles, and other parts of the world, and it ends from 1945 to 1994 to mark the period that apartheid ended. And Manuel Haas, African Modernisms, Architecture of Independence, and of course, the Louisiana Museum of Denmark in Copenhagen did another edition. The numbers are innumerable, but what these books have in common is that they are telling us how beautiful the architecture, the modernism is. And I think there is a space for that. Now, architecture and politics is telling us, wait a minute, you guys are covering everything or sweeping everything under the rug. There is something else to be seen more than this Gloriana. Let's all talk about it in the open. So if you do have a chance, please do have the opportunity to look into the book. But as I'm hearing my colleagues discuss something strong together, which I will just use to end. 1980, as Abuja was still in the bushes, Saudi Arabia donated about $20 million. Nigerian Muslim community collected more money, and the National Mosque was built in Abuja. And then, with the death of Sani Abacha and Abdul Salami and Obasanjo coming into power, the National Cathedral was built. The National Mosque is here, the National Cathedral is here, and Independence Avenue straddles the two. You could see them. 1994, just before the wise man, President Hofoboni, died, Pope Jean Paul II goes to inaugurate the Basilica of Our Lady of Peace. By the way, he had gone there to inaugurate, there is a St. Paul's Cathedral in Abidjan, named after him, with his statue in front. He had gone there to inaugurate that, then he went to Yamoussoukro to lay the foundation, and the story you told about which one is taller, that seems to be something that is documented, that is true. And then, here you have a great opportunity, and why do I say that? If there is going to be an ecumenical center that brings these different denominations together, which is also what happens to the National Cathedral at Abuja. It appears to me that there should be an equivalence of its mosque or other religions in the country. Why? I could feel the tension the Basilica was causing over Côte d'Ivoire, where there is quite a significant number of Muslims in the north and around the country. And I could feel the tension the National Cathedral and the National Mosque were positioning each other to be. I don't need to tell you the story of Boko Haram. What Boko Haram is saying is the mosque didn't go far enough. You have an opportunity here to rewrite that story. Upon the death of the President Hofo-Boigny, I wouldn't say it was a religious war. No, I wouldn't say that, but I wouldn't rule out that it was a factor. Because a segment of the society is feeling marginalized. In other words, there needs to be equity. And the architect has nothing to do with any of these seasons. Whether it is at Abuja or at Yamoussoukro or here. Why is that? The architect delivers what the client wants. It's like selling a car. In fact, architecture is a merchandise. Don't forget that. If it wasn't a merchandise, the tallest buildings in the world wouldn't be in the Levant or in the Middle East. It would be in the United States of America. The highest bidder can purchase it. Architecture is no different from clothes, cars, Rolls Royces. It's just that they are bigger and taller. But they are merchandise. And I think as an architect, they have principles, they do what they need to do, but they will sell you the good that you want to purchase. That shouldn't distract from the opportunity you have to have a good debate that is inclusive about equity, about human rights, about inclusion. And with that, thank you for including me in this process.
Finally, and before we take some questions, Dr. Lloyd George Eduamwa is a scholar and public intellectual who's well known for his incisive analysis concerning political issues of national interest. He's a senior lecturer here at the Department of Political Science and also the founding director of the Center of Asian Studies here at the University of Ghana. Welcome.
So, thank you, Kukua, for the introduction, and good evening to everyone. Once I started working in the field of architecture, I asked myself, why do you get yourself into trouble? Because, of course, my training is in philosophy and political studies and public policy. But I will ascribe this daring to my dad, who essentially will talk unendingly about cities. So I got the bug, I should say. Well, this same man taught me to be balanced, because that's how he lived. He taught us always balance the way you think. So my review would try to be balanced. I would first talk about what I consider, of course, to be the great things about the book, and then kind of segue into what I'll term some other niggling issues that all of us need to ponder about. But first and foremost, I must state, I'll be remiss not to state, that this work is an important work. I thought it was 11 chapters, but Julia said it's 12 chapters, so maybe I miscounted, but 12 chapters, right? And then an intro, and then an afterword, which Kukwa just spoke about. Great because for me it opens a vital frontier for African political science, political studies in contemporary times. Now, why do I say it's a vital opening of or the opening of a vital frontier? Because I think as I worked in the area, I got anguished, I got angry, I got bored. Because it seemed as if, especially as I came up in the 80s and the 90s, that stuff about politics, about power, who has it, and the basis for legitimizing it, etc., had come to be besotted, obsessed, and seduced. Or more to the point, even trapped by elections, corruption, good governance, and now sustainable development goals. All of these things matter, for sure. But it is the blinkering effect that keeps the field in my view, and I teach it. Right? My colleagues work in the area. The sense in which we seem locked into this frame, this lens, that I feel is the malaise, the problem. And so I think that this work opens up a new jazzy, sexy, elevating, freeing opening. Because I personally insist on that kind of scholarship, right? Scholarship that is lateral in its vision, in its flow, without losing sight of its fundamental moorings and foundations. Now, I want to tie this in terms of frontier questions. So what I do is I push the frontier to the emergent discourse as well that comes with this din, this noise of good governance, corruption, etc. The issue of the so-called infrastructural deficit in Africa. That has become a buzzword, at least before COVID. Now it's disease. But before COVID, especially in Ghanaian political discourse, you had the constant refrain that infrastructure issues need to be dealt with. And of course, the African Development Bank puts a figure on it and says, or claimed we needed yearly about 170 billion US dollars to plug that deficit. But the discourse was locked in the enervating logic of capitalism, profits. So infrastructure basically was about how it will mediate the process of ensuring that business means business, right? But this is exactly what this book tries to move us away. And I love that. Because it tells us that buildings and building them and constructions matter far more than just mammon and money. And that there's more to buildings and construction than resources, monetary resources, mammon. So, this is what the work does. It's what I see. And it tries to capture this notional shift away from, especially, obviously, unchallengeably, this World Banky discourse. Captures this in structures and spaces an airport, a cathedral, religion, of course. Parliament, AU headquarters, a prison, housing, library, palace, shopping mall, police station, and a park. So, yes, I think the frontier is shifting. But some of us began this work way back when in 2014, riding around Accra with my wife. Before 2014, I saw the Chinese putting up the Foreign Affairs building, and then a bulb went up in my mind. Of course, my wife is smarter than me, so I said, Sylvia, what do you think, Nana? This building, I think I should read it. She says, yeah, look this way. And so I wrote an article published in 2014, which I think is one of the first moves in the field that tries to explicitly connect politics and architecture and Africa in contemporary times. But when I went at it, it was damn hard. Of course, I wasn't trained in architecture. So my tools were not structured for what I wanted to do. So I had to learn and read and all of that. But 8 years down the line, in 2022, I think here we are. This work helps to clear the haze for many scholars who would like to look at this important tie between architecture and politics. And it does so in 3 moves, almost like a symphonic orchestra, or maybe a Fela-esque Afrobeat sound. And I like my Fela, because when you listen to it, you see the syncopations, the combinations of moves that made Fela great. And this work attempts that in what it calls very well laid out. When we started, we struggled. Here, I can see the obvious exercise of thought and carefulness that will help this area of discourse. And so they call it making, living, and imagining. 3 different, as the music people will say, 3 different scores, if you like. But I'll not bore you with the details, because the master who came before me, my Nigerian neighbor and senior man, has really unpacked it. So I'll be superfluous to restate the obvious. But this making, living, and imagining gestures to theory, in my view, or pushes us to the questions of theory, which I love. Now, the famous Jamaican, but later on African-American philosopher, Charles Mills, who died recently and was my mentor, with whom I communicated constantly, he wrote a famous book, which I teach my students in political philosophy, The Racial Contract. Charles Mills says, naming a thing brings it to life. So I think that in the making, living, and imagining, some important naming has taken place, and therefore sets us on the path to theorizing this, I don't know if I want to call it subfield, but whatever it is, this area of discursive concerns over building and constructions and what they mean. And I think Kukua's afterward shows all the signs of theoretical pregnancy, right? the issue of bringing something to birth, which she captures in the argument that we should look at all structures as being architecturally relevant. We'll see where she goes with this as she continues on her intellectual path. But I wish that with this first move that she gives us some useful lens or framework or theory. Now, within this attempt to give us lenses and theory, whatever you want to call it, the book points us to the need for the question of the decolonial, which I think is useful. I struggle when folks say, what is Africa? Because I think it's obvious, in a sense, but it's not so obvious, of course, with all the history. But here, on this point, I go into my other side of my discourse, beyond the grid to the needling. I think that once the work mentioned the decolonial, I was hoping that in terms of the leading thinkers mentioned, in terms of how the book was thought through foundationally, that there will be less privileging of Baudot and Foucault, and that we'll see some compelling African thinkers in there. So I miss that. And I look for that always in my work. I remember as a doctoral student, I confronted Sabatier, Paul. I said, look, you're talking about all these public policy theories, but there's no Africa, and yet you want to claim universality about your work. And actually, he conceded. And then throughout the conference, will sit with me the whole time. So I look out for these things. And I think there are compelling African writers that could have been brought into the fray. Atukwe Singh, for example, my good friend who continues to do groundbreaking work in urban stuff. Achilim Bebe, Chiwenzu, Aikuyama, many African scholars. So if we want to deal with this decolonial question, we should break the chains of seemingly, focusing on non-African scholarship, as it were. And to tie this point to another point, I was expecting the book to also dialogue with earlier work. And there's been earlier work on this question. I have worked with Chinese scholars. We just actually published a book this year, about 15 chapters. Charlie Xue, Ding, a collection of guys who essentially, because they are Chinese and because of China's movement into the world, have really been thinking about the issue and provide illuminating insights. The last book looks at the whole chain of things. So maybe let's begin to dialogue, right? Let's open up the spaces with each other, and I think we'll learn, right? And to my last point, not to bore you, I've worked in it for a while, but I've been working in the area of digital technology, convergences, artificial intelligence, and the politics of it. And I just did some work that's about to come out. I didn't see that in this work, in the age of bits and bytes. And recently, there's a special issue in global convergence, I think, one journal, which is looking at commodity value chains, or global value chains, as you say, and the ways in which IT is shaking up production. Buildings will not escape from that datafication, and how smart houses and all of that will play a role. They are here. And I raised that point with the AU building before Le Monde took it, but never credited me. And I'm going to fight them forever. And of course, with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs built by the Chinese, and also the Ministry of Defense. Right? So the digital world is here. And the technology question cannot be missed, should not be missed, as we try to tie construction and building together and to try to make sense of those. So to Julia and the team, and those who contributed, this is seminal work, as the master who came before me laid down. And we thank you for doing that. That's the point of living, actually. To live something people would think about when you are just dust and back to being a source for a building. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes for questions. Well, we're supposed to close at 5:30. Someone is saying it's too small. We're supposed to close at 5:30 and then go for drinks outside, so we can continue the discussions over some nice small chops and drinks. But yeah, any questions now? Comments?
Yes, hi. First of all, thank you for this event and for the book. I accidentally heard about it. It's my first time here in Ghana. Israel was mentioned here. I'm originally Israeli, but here's now a lecturer at the Department of Architecture in Cambridge, back in the UK. I was and I teach a course on space and power, so this will go directly to the syllabus this year already. So I'm happy to hear about it more. I'm curious about the discussion that started here just now with and you also commented on it, on the question of what architecture is and what should be considered as architecture as such. And I'm interested in the editorial process of the book. Why particular, scholars, participants, and buildings were considered, and others or other forms of spatial creation were not considered. And this is really in relation to the discussion of what architecture is in relation to this kind of Eurocentric perspective on architecture. And yes, I was wondering if that entered into the discussion in an earlier phase than your kind of ending chapter that was later changed. Thanks.
No, it was not changed.
Oh, okay. So I'm curious, even wanted to read it. But yes, I wonder if it was part of the discussion earlier, the question of what architecture is.
Do you want me to take that? Yes, sure. Great, thank you. I feel, I have to be completely honest. So the editorial process of the buildings scholars were chosen by the collection of people who attended the workshop. So I guess we have to go back to think, and I'm trying to remember now, how we went and how we chose those scholars. And I think we started with choosing scholars who had, we thought, something interesting to say, some interesting perspective on architecture. And some of the scholars that attended the workshop who couldn't contribute to the book were doing perhaps less conventional things. There was somebody who was talking about the space program in Zambia, for example. Somebody who was writing on petrol stations. Just trying to think who else there were. So, in a sense, the collection ended up as an outcome of the workshop where we did discuss what architecture meant. And one of the joys of it was bringing together people like me who aren't architects and people like Kuka who are architects, who, you know, we had a lot to learn, as Lloyd talks about having a lot to learn, about how we define architecture and what we mean by it. But I suspect quite a lot of us who weren't architects started out with a fairly conventional view that we had to look at a particular building. But because we were talking about political buildings, and my particular interest, for example, is I'm interested in the state, so I want to look at buildings that citizens define as the buildings of the state. So that's how citizens define them. And so we ended up with the big sort of iconic buildings of the state, the formal architecture, and also buildings like hospitals, police stations, and so on, which sometimes are sort of big, impressive, formal buildings, and sometimes they're really not. But I guess what I would say to you is that the book was the beginning of this discussion, and we assembled this group. Now, most of them were from different parts of Africa, and they were certainly studying different parts of Africa. And I think maybe I'll say just something in reply to Lloyd's point about the decoloniality. I don't think we set out to make a contribution to decolonial theory. I think we set out to make a contribution to decolonial writing in the sense that we were, I'm not, but my co-author is, she's Ivorian, and most of the authors are African. And we are all writing about and taking seriously African buildings in the way that that says, you know, that these are serious buildings that need to be thought about, and that the politics needs to be taken seriously. And so, in that sense, I think perhaps it was more of an empirical approach to something that was trying to be decolonial, rather than a theoretical one. If that's Eurocentric, then I think we've come some way since then. I hope that the workshop we've had here is less so, if that one was. But perhaps I'll hand over to Kukwa, who can talk a little bit about her. I don't know, you want to talk about your...
Yeah, sure. But just to add to that, and something I didn't mention when I was talking about my chapter, was also that when I would ask people who had built these buildings that I wanted us to take seriously, that they did not think it was architecture. And this is also an after effect of colonization. So for these chapters in the books that had this empirical approach, it started with what the people they were interacting with thought was architecture. And unfortunately, a lot of people also here think that architecture is the grand, the powerful, because this is it's so ingrained in us. So that's where like my afterword also started from, that it's just so complete that we see the kiosk and we do not think this could be beautiful expression of taste or anything. Another question?
I mean, I'd also like to make a claim to say that it is part of it, of what should be studied, these big buildings, built by big-name architects. They are, and certainly in terms of, if we're looking at politics, they're really important. We do need to take them seriously.
Throughout the presentation, we understand that the better part of it was to build the architecture and the history part of it. But now, the future, what we're dealing with, is that we have to deal with the policymakers now. Because they're the ones that decide whether here we should have a 6-lane road, whether here we should have a 100-story building. They're the ones that they decide, they look for the resources. And now, how is the book connecting these policymakers, i.e. the politicians, and the architects themselves, and the architectural work itself? How are the policymakers going to involve the tactics in their projects. Because most of the work that you've shown, you said the incredible buildings, but no architect was involved. So that's why you can group, those amazing buildings and the slums together, because there was no architectural planning initially. So how is the book coming up with a balance between the policymakers, like the politicians, and also the architects themselves?
Can I?
Yes.
So I'm not part of the book though, but I just want to give an example. I mean, you are right about the disjunct, right, in terms of the work and how it's going to affect policymakers or influence them. And for that, and this will be for the scholars who worked on this, the policy impact would definitely be a function of how they are entrepreneurial in terms of driving any prescriptive ideas that are embedded in the work. And I give you an example of my own work on China. Right? So I did a series of things. And I was clear in my mind that the politicians or the policymakers are critical to the questions I'm looking at. So I began to find ways of letting them hear me on these things and others, and all of that. Well, that process can generate some connection. So, for example, in Ghana, that's how, for example, the presidents decided to, of course, they have their own ideas, but they decided to have some work on putting together a China policy. So it is partly the ways in which the interface between politicians and scholars can probably be constructed, or some other means, found to get to them. But we know how complex that is. Well, you write what you want. Jerome said, what's Jerome?
Sorry, I can see
Okay.
you passionately started. It's 2 minutes past 5:30, and let's continue this. And I'll just mention, Lloyd, that we have our second workshop, participants of our second workshop, who are people trying to work in policy and practitioners there.
Right.
And yeah, so let's go and then eat some food and drink some things and continue the discussion. Thank you for coming.